My name is Michael, and this is the story of how I lost everything I thought I wanted, only to find everything I actually needed. It's about a woman who changed my life in ways I never expected. A bottle of wine that cost more than most people's rent, and the moment I finally learned the difference between love and being used. To continue listening to this beautiful and special story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Write your name and the city you're watching from so I can include a special shout out for you in an upcoming story. I remember that Tuesday evening in Austin like it was yesterday. The Texas heat was finally breaking, and I was sitting in my downtown apartment, looking out at the city lights, reflecting off Lady Bird Lake. At 32, I had everything I thought I wanted. A six-figure job at a tech startup, a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows, and enough money in the bank to make my parents proud. But I was lonely. Not the kind of lonely you feel at a party surrounded by strangers, but the deep kind that settles in your bones when you realize success doesn't keep you warm at night. I'd built my career brick by brick, working 16-hour days, sacrificing weekends, turning down dates because I needed to focus. And there I was, successful and empty. That's when I decided to take that trip to Los Angeles. My buddy Jake had been telling me for months that I needed to get out of Austin, see the world, meet someone who wasn't from Texas. Dude, he'd say, you're turning into a robot. When's the last time you did something spontaneous? So I booked a flight to LAX, rented a convertible, and drove straight to Venice Beach. The salt air, the chaos of the boardwalk, the street performers and artists, it was everything Austin wasn't. Raw, unpredictable, alive. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. That's where she found me. I was sitting at this little coffee shop called Groundwork, trying to look like I belonged among the laptops and man buns, when she walked in. Camila. Even her name sounded like music. She had this long, dark hair that caught the California sunlight streaming through the windows, and when she smiled at the barista, her whole face lit up like she was genuinely happy to be alive. She ordered her coffee in this beautiful, accented English that immediately told me she wasn't from around here. When she turned around, scanning for a table, our eyes met. Instead of that awkward look-away thing most people do, she just smiled and walked right over. Mind if I sit? She asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. Everywhere else is taken. It wasn't true. There were 3 other empty tables. But I wasn't about to point that out. Please, I said, closing my laptop. I'm Michael. Camila, she said, settling into her chair with this graceful ease that made it seem like she belonged everywhere she went. You're not from LA, are you? Austin. How could you tell? She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that makes you want to say funnier things just to hear it again. You look too genuine, too real. LA people have this practiced, casual thing going on. You're just sitting there being yourself. We talked for 3 hours, about everything. She told me she was from São Paulo, Brazil, and had come to LA to study art and find herself, which should have been my first red flag, but at the time sounded romantic and adventurous. She talked about wanting to open her own studio, about the way light fell differently in California than in Brazil, about dreams that were so big and beautiful they took my breath away. I told her about my work, about Austin, about how I'd built my entire life around being responsible and practical, and how sometimes I wondered what it would feel like to just let go. You should try it sometime, she said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Letting go. It's scary, but it's also the only way to really live. When we finally left the coffee shop, the sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that looked like they'd been designed just for us. She asked if I wanted to walk on the beach, and I said yes without thinking. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't check my phone, didn't worry about emails, didn't think about tomorrow's meetings. We just walked and talked and watched the waves crash against the shore. The next few months were a blur of flights between Austin and LA, of phone calls that lasted until 3 in the morning, of feeling like I'd finally found the missing piece of myself. Camila had this way of making everything seem possible, like life was this grand adventure and I'd been sitting on the sidelines for too long. She'd send me photos of sunsets from Venice Beach, of her paintings in progress, of little moments throughout her day that she wanted to share with me. I'd wake up to voice messages in Portuguese and English, her voice bright and warm even through my phone speakers. Bon dia, meu amor, she'd say. Good morning, my love. I'm thinking about you. I started flying to LA every other weekend. She'd pick me up at LAX in her beat-up Honda Civic, music blasting, windows down, her hair flying in the wind, as we drove through the city. She showed me parts of Los Angeles I never would have found on my own. Hidden taco stands in East LA, galleries in the Arts District, beaches where locals went instead of tourists. Everything with her felt alive, electric, like I was finally living in color after years of black and white. She was struggling financially, which I understood. Art school is expensive, and she was here on a student visa, working part-time jobs that barely covered her basics. When she mentioned having trouble making rent, I offered to help without even thinking about it. "Are you?" she asked. But there was relief in her eyes that made my heart ache. "Of course," I said. "We're a team now, right?" So I started sending her money, not just for rent, but for groceries, for art supplies, for the little things that would make her life easier. It felt good to take care of someone, to know that my success could make a difference in her world. She'd call me crying with gratitude, telling me I was her hero, her angel, the best thing that had ever happened to her. I believed every word. 6 months in, supporting Camila had become as routine as paying my own bills. 500 here for rent, 300 there for groceries, another 200 for art supplies. When her car broke down, I sent 1,000 for repair. When she got accepted into a summer art program, I covered the tuition. She never asked directly. She was too smart for that. Instead, she'd call me voice shaking, talking about how stressed she was about money, how she didn't know what she was going to do, and I'd swoop in like some kind of financial superhero, solving her problems with my credit card. "You don't understand what this means to me," she'd say. "You're giving me the chance to follow my dreams. I'll pay you back someday. I promise." But I didn't want her to pay me. I wanted to be needed. I wanted to be the reason she could pursue her art, the reason she could stay in LA, the reason she smiled. It made me feel important in a way that closing deals and debugging code never could. My friends in Austin started to notice. Jake was the first to say something. "Dude, how much are you sending this girl?" he asked, over beers at our usual spot downtown. "It's not like that," I said. "I'm helping my girlfriend. That's what you do when you love someone." "But she's never even been to Austin, has she? In 6 months she's never come to see your life here." He was right. But I had explanations. She was busy with school, flights were expensive. She'd come soon. "I just think you should be careful," Jake said. "Long-distance relationships are hard enough without adding money to the equation." I brushed him off. Jake was single. Had been single for years. What did he know about love? By month 8, the amounts were getting bigger. 1,000 for a new laptop for her design work. 1,500 for a photography course she absolutely had to take. 2,000 when her roommate moved out and she needed to cover the full rent until she found someone new. I was making good money, but even I was starting to feel the strain. I'd cut back on my own expenses, stopped going out as much, canceled a vacation I'd been planning. But every time Camila called, voice thick with tears, talking about how overwhelmed she was, how she didn't know what she was going to do, I found myself reaching for my wallet again. "You're saving my life," she'd whisper into the phone. "I don't know what I'd do without you." And God help me, I loved hearing that. I loved being her savior, her provider, the solid, reliable man who could fix all her problems. It made me feel like all those years of building my career, all that sacrifice and discipline, had been worth something. She started talking about our future more, about how grateful she'd always be, about the studio we'd open together someday, about the life we'd build. She painted these beautiful pictures with her words, futures where we were partners in everything, where her art was successful, and she could contribute equally to our relationship. "I'm going to make this up to you," she'd say. "Someday when I'm established, when my art is selling, I'm going to spoil you the way you've spoiled me." I held on to those promises like lifelines. But there were other changes too. She seemed less interested in our long phone conversations, more distracted when we video chat. When I visited LA, she was often tired, or had plans with friends I'd never met, or needed to work on projects that couldn't wait. "You understand, right?" she'd say. "You know how important my art is to me." Of course I understood. I was proud of her dedication, her passion. I just wished sometimes that passion extended to us, to our relationship, to the future we were supposedly building together. Month 10. I was lying in bed in my Austin apartment, staring at my bank account on my phone. In less than a year, I'd sent Camila over $20,000. 20,000. That was more than some people made in a year, and I'd just given it away. For the first time, I started doing math instead of just feeling. $20,000. For someone I saw maybe twice a month. Someone who had never once offered to come to Austin, never once suggested we split the cost of anything, never once said, "You know what, I can handle this one myself." I started paying attention to things I'd ignored before, like how she always seemed to know exactly how much to ask for. Never so much that I'd say no, but always enough to solve her immediate problem. Like how her crises seemed to come in cycles, perfectly timed to when I'd gotten my bonus or closed a big deal. Like how she never wanted to video chat anymore when I was sending money, preferring to handle those conversations over text or quick phone calls. "I'm just so grateful I can't even look at you without crying," she'd said the last time I'd suggested FaceTime. While she was asking for rent money, I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. So badly. But I started keeping track of the amounts, the timing, the reasons, and a pattern emerged that made my stomach turn. Every crisis was urgent. Every solution required exactly the amount I could afford to send. Every thank you was emotional and dramatic and followed by a period of distance. I was being played. I knew it in my gut, but I couldn't bring myself to face it, because facing it would mean admitting I'd been a fool. That the woman I loved, the woman I'd restructured my entire life around, saw me as nothing more than a bank account with feelings. It was a Thursday in November when I decided to surprise her. I'd finished a big project early, gotten a bonus, and thought, why not fly to LA unannounced? Show up at her door with flowers and that bottle of wine I'd been saving. A 1997 Barolo that cost me $800 and was supposed to be for a special occasion. I took the red-eye, landed at LAX at 6 in the morning, and drove straight to her apartment in Venice. I had a key she'd given me months earlier, back when everything felt perfect and full of possibility. I let myself in quietly, planning to surprise her with breakfast and coffee, and the promise of a long weekend together. But she wasn't in her bedroom. I could hear her voice coming from the living room, talking on the phone in rapid Portuguese. I couldn't understand the words, but I could hear the tone, light, laughing, happy. I walked into the kitchen to start the coffee, and that's when I heard her switch to English. No, he's so easy, she was saying. I just get him. I'm stressed about money and he sends whatever I ask for. Last week I got $2,000 just by crying a little. My hands froze on the coffee maker. I know, right? American men are so predictable. They want to be the hero so badly they'll pay anything for the privilege. She was laughing, actually laughing while talking about me like I was some kind of joke, some kind of mark in a con game. I stood there in her kitchen, holding my $800 bottle of wine, listening to the woman I loved explain to someone else how easy it was to manipulate me, how stupid I was, how predictable. He thinks we're building a future together, she continued. It's actually kind of sweet how naive he is. That's when something inside me just broke. Not my heart, that would come later, but my illusions, my denial, my desperate need to believe that what we had was real. I walked into the living room, where she was sprawled on the couch, phone pressed to her ear, wearing a silk robe I'd bought her the month before. When she saw me, her face went white. Michael, she dropped the phone like it was on fire. What are you doing here? I thought you were coming next weekend. I set the wine down on her coffee table and just looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time in almost a year, I saw her clearly, the practiced surprise in her eye, the quick calculation happening behind them, as she figured out how much I'd heard and how she could spin it. Who were you talking to? I asked, my voice calmer than I felt. My sister, she said quickly. She was asking about you. About us. In English? She blinked. She's practicing her English. By talking about how easy it is to manipulate American men. The silence stretched between us like a canyon. I watched her face cycle through emotions, surprise, panic, calculation, and finally, a kind of resigned defiance. It's not what it sounded like, she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. What did it sound like, Camila? You're taking it out of context. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. I sat down across from her, suddenly feeling exhausted. I understand that I'm easy. I understand that you just have to cry a little and I'll send whatever you ask for. I understand that you think I'm naive and predictable. Michael, please, how much of it was real? I asked. Any of it? She started crying then, but it wasn't the same crying I'd heard over the phone for months. This was different. Uglier, more desperate. Of course it was real. I do care about you. I do. You've been amazing to me. You've changed my life. I've funded your life, I correct. There's a difference. That's not fair. What's not fair is that I've spent the last year thinking I was in love with someone who saw me as a wallet. She reached for me, but I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Venice boardwalk where we'd had our first walk, where I'd first felt like I was living instead of just existing. You don't understand what it's like, she said behind me. Being here alone, trying to make it, having no money. So you decided to make it my problem. I never forced you to give me anything. I turned around. No, you were much smarter than that. You just made sure I felt like a hero every time I solved your problem. Made sure I felt needed, important, loved. We talked for another hour, but it was like watching someone try to rebuild a house that had already burned to the foundation. Every explanation she offered just made it worse. Yes, she'd been talking to her friend about how to get more money from me. Yes, she'd been strategic about timing her requests. Yes, she'd been seeing someone else. But it wasn't serious, Michael. Not like what we have. What we had, past tense, even in her own mind. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was the realization that I'd fallen in love with a performance. Every sweet text, every grateful phone call, every promise about our future. It had all been carefully crafted to keep me invested, keep me sending money, keep me believing in something that had never existed. I do care about you, she kept saying. That part was real. Maybe it was. Maybe somewhere in the middle of using me, she'd developed some genuine affection. But it didn't matter anymore. You can't build a relationship on a foundation of lies and manipulation, no matter how much genuine feeling you sprinkle on top. I thought about all the times I'd canceled plans with friends to take her calls, all the weekends I'd flown to LA instead of living my own life in Austin, all the ways I'd made myself smaller to make her problems bigger, because solving her problems made me feel important. I'd been so afraid of being alone, that I'd accepted being used, so desperate to be needed, that I'd confused being exploited with being loved. What do you want me to say? She finally asked, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Nothing, I said. There's nothing left to say. I picked up that $800 bottle of wine and headed for the door. Where are you going? I turned back one last time. She looked small sitting there on the couch, wrapped in the silk robe I'd bought her, surrounded by the art supplies I'd paid for, in the apartment I'd helped her keep. I'm going home, I said. To my life. I didn't open that bottle of wine on the plane back to Austin. Instead, I sat there in seat 14A, flying over the desert between California and Texas. And I made a list. Not of everything I'd lost. That was too depressing, but of everything I'd learned. I'd learned that love and need aren't the same thing. That being someone's solution doesn't make you their partner. That you can't buy your way into someone's heart, no matter how much you spend or how grateful they seem. I'd learned that I'd been so busy trying to be the perfect boyfriend, that I'd forgotten to ask whether she was trying to be the perfect girlfriend, that I'd been so focused on giving that I'd never noticed she wasn't giving back. Most importantly, I'd learned that I'd rather be alone and honest than together and used. When I got back to Austin, I did something I should have done months earlier. I called my bank and closed the joint account I'd opened for sending Camila money. I changed my phone number. I deleted her contact information and blocked her on every social media platform. It felt like cutting off a limb at first. For weeks, I'd reach for my phone to text her about something funny I'd seen, or to ask about her day, or to check if she needed anything. The silence was deafening. But slowly, something else started to grow in that silence. Space for myself, time for my own thoughts, my own plans, my own dreams. I started hanging out with Jake again, going to local shows, exploring Austin like it was a new city instead of just the place I worked and slept. 3 months later, I met Sarah at a bookstore downtown. She was buying a cookbook, I was buying a biography, and we ended up in line together, making jokes about how neither of us would probably actually cook or read our purchases. When she offered to buy me coffee, I said yes. When the coffee turned into dinner, and dinner turned into a walk around Town Lake, I realized I was having fun without keeping score. Sarah has her own career, her own apartment, her own life that doesn't revolve around needing me to solve her problems. When we go out to dinner, she pays sometimes. When I travel for work, She doesn't call crying about crises that only money can solve. When she says she loves me, I believe her, because she loved me before I ever spent a dime on her. That $800 bottle of wine, I finally opened it 6 months ago, on the night Sarah and I moved in together. We drank it while sitting on the floor of our new apartment, surrounded by boxes, planning our future together. A real future, built on partnership instead of dependency. I never heard from Camila again after that night in Venice. Sometimes I wonder if she found another easy American man to fund her dreams. Sometimes I hope she actually learned to fund them herself. But mostly, I don't think about her at all, because I learned the most important lesson of my life in that little apartment by the beach. The right person will never make you feel like a bank account. They'll make you feel like a partner. And that, it turns out, is worth more than all the money in the world.